This video is sponsored by Card Kingdom. You can visit their store by using my referral link in the description below. Hi everyone, I'm Neat Sahone, and today I'm continuing with my Innistrad Midnight Hunt limited set review. The review began yesterday with a look at all the multicolored and colorless cards, and today we're taking a look at every white card in the set. In this video, I'll give you my thoughts about every single one of these cards with regard to the limited format. To sum up each of these cards, I give them a letter grade. If you're not familiar with my grading system, you can find an explanation in the description. Alright, let's take a look at our first white card. First up, it's Adaline Resplendent Cathar, which for 1 generic and 2 white is a star 4 legendary human knight at rare. She has vigilance, and her power is equal to the number of creatures you control, and when you attack, for each opponent you create a 1/1 white human creature token that's tapped and attacking that player or a planeswalker they control. So, she's a 3-mana 1/4 with vigilance at worst, and that's the kind of body that would make the cut sometimes, and obviously she'll often be significantly larger, especially because she brings a friend along to the fight when she attacks, so once she attacks she'll be at least a 2/4, also attacking with a 1/1, so she seems like a pretty nice rare. I'm giving her a B. Next up, it's Ambitious Farmhand, which for 1 generic and a white is a 1/1 human peasant at uncommon, and when it enters the battlefield, you search your library for a basic plains card, reveal it, and put it into your hand, and then shuffle. And it has the Gavin keyword ability, a new ability in this set that means you get some extra effect if you control at least 3 creatures with 3 different powers. In this case, you can pay 1 generic and 2 white, and if you have Gavin going, it'll transform into Seasoned Cathar, a 3/3 with lifelink. This seems pretty nice. A 2-mana 1/1 that draws you a card is always playable and limited, and this one makes sure you hit your next land drop. And because it can transform into a 3/3 with lifelink, that means it stays relevant pretty much all game long. Now, you do have to jump through some hoops to get the card to transform, and assembling a Coven won't always be a walk in the park, but it's also reasonably doable. Note, by the way, that it can transform at instant speed. Anyway, I think this is something you can first pick in some weaker packs. I'm giving it a B-. Next up, it's Beloved Beggar, which for 1 generic and a white is a 0/4 human peasant at uncommon, and it has Disturb, another new mechanic that lets you pay a cost while the card's in your graveyard, and if you do, it returns to the battlefield transformed. In this case, you can pay 4 generic and 2 white, and what you get back is Generous Soul, a 4/4 with flying and vigilance, and if it would be put into a graveyard from anywhere, you exile it. This also looks pretty good. You play it early as a reasonable blocker and it will inevitably die, and then in the late game it can come out of your graveyard and be a very real win condition. 6 mana for a 4/4 with flying and vigilance certainly isn't insanely efficient, but it isn't that far off from what I'd be willing to pay. The 0/4 side won't ever allow you to actually trade with anything, but keeping your opponent at bay with this has some value, especially since it can become a very real win condition later. Also keep in mind, like with all of these cards that do things in the graveyard, you can find a way to put them into your graveyard and then just skip casting it normally altogether if you want to. I think this is a B-. Next up, it's Bereaved Survivor, which for 2 generic and a white is a 2/1 human peasant at uncommon, and whenever another creature you control dies, you transform it, and it becomes Dauntless Avenger, and whenever it attacks, target creature card with mana value 2 or less comes back from your graveyard to the battlefield tapped and attacking, and it's a 3/2. A 3-mana 2/1 is pretty ugly. Transforming this is fairly doable though, and once it transforms, it is a nice little card, though it won't always have things worth reanimating. I'm giving it a C+. Next up, it's Blessed Defiance, which for 1 white is a common instant, and it says target creature you control gets +2/+0 and gains lifelink until end of turn. When that creature dies this turn, create a 1/1 white spirit creature token with flying. This doesn't seem like a great trick to me. Only increasing power means there's a good chance your creature will still be dying, and while the life that you gain and the 1/1 flyer you get in exchange for that makes a difference, it will still feel pretty close to getting 2 for 1, and I don't like that. I'm giving this a D+. Next up, it's Borrowed Time, which for 2 generic and a white is an uncommon enchantment, and when it enters the battlefield, you exile target non-land permanent an opponent controls until it leaves the battlefield. This is premium removal. It hits any non-land permanent, no questions asked. Like other Oblivion Ring-like cards, your opponent can get the things back if they destroy a Respite, but that's worth the risk. You're still trading 1 for 1 in that scenario anyway. This is a B+. Next up, it's Brutal Cathar, which for 2 generic and a white is a 2/2 human soldier werewolf at rare. When it enters the battlefield or transforms into Brutal Cathar, you exile target creature an opponent controls until this creature leaves the battlefield. And it has Daybound, which basically means that if it's daytime when you play this card, it will come into play as Brutal Cathar. For more on how this Daybound, Nightbound stuff works, I would direct you towards the first video in this series where I went a lot deeper on how it works. And that first video is the one on multicolored and colorless cards, so check that out. But suffice it to say, sometimes this will come into play as Brutal Cathar. Other times, if it's night, it'll come into play as Moonrage Brute, which is a 3/3 with first strike and ward, pay 3 life. That means if your opponent wants to target it with a thing, their spell gets countered unless they pay 3 life. So this looks amazing. A 3-mana 2/2 that exiles a thing until it leaves is already an excellent card, and this comes with the massive upside of potentially transforming into a much more imposing creature. A 3-mana 3/3 with first strike tends to be relevant all game long, and ward makes it so that your opponent has to punish themselves if they ever want to kill it. This card is insanely efficient and can even potentially exile multiple things as it shifts between day and night, which is just going to get silly. This is a bomb. I'm giving it an A. Next up, it's Candlegrove Witch, which for 1 generic and a white is a 2/2 human warlock, and at the beginning of combat on your turn, if you get Coven going, it gains flying until end of turn. This is a bear that will often, though certainly not always, have flying in the late game. Flying helps it stay relevant throughout the game, and that means it's a pretty nice little 2-drop, giving it a C. Next up, it's Candletrap, which for 1 white mana is a common enchantment aura. It's an enchant creature. Enchanted creature has Defender and prevent all combat damage that would be dealt by enchanted creature. This also has Coven, and in this case, if you have Coven's requirement met, you can pay 2 generic and a white to sacrifice Candletrap and exile the enchanted creature. This is pretty cheap removal. Before you get Coven online, it definitely isn't great removal because it allows the creature to still block, and that's usually not what you want to be doing. It can't do damage at least, but it's still a presence on the board, and that means you aren't really trading a full 1-for-1. But it's nice that in the later game, you can just get rid of that creature entirely. Still, it's probably a little too slow and clunky to be premium. I'm giving it a C+. Next up, it's Cathar Commando, which for 1 generic and a white is a 3/1 human soldier at common. It's got flash, and you can pay 1 and sack it to destroy target artifact or enchantment. You can flash this into ambush and X3, and most X3s will cost more than the commando, so that's pretty nice. The additional utility of blowing up artifacts and enchantments doesn't hurt either. This is a solid common. I'm giving it a C. Next up, it's Cathar's Call, which for 2 generic and a white is an uncommon enchantment aura with enchant creature. Enchanted creature has vigilance, and at the beginning of your end step, create a 1/1 white human creature token. I don't love this. 3 mana is a lot for an enchantment that offers only a very minimal boost to the creature you're actually putting it on. Vigilance just isn't something to get excited about on like 90% of creatures. It's nice that it turns out a token every turn, but you probably need to get at least 2 of them before the investment feels reasonable, and you're going to get blown out in a big way if your opponent just kills the creature you stick this on, and that won't be very hard because the card didn't enhance the creature in any very meaningful way. Green-white definitely wants to go wide, but there are way less risky ways of doing it, many of which we'll see in this video. I think this is just a D+. Next up, it's Celeste's Sanctifier, which for 2 generic and a white is a 3/2 human cleric at common. If it's neither day nor night, it becomes day as Celeste's Sanctifier enters the battlefield. And whenever day becomes night or night becomes day, look at the top 2 cards of your library, put one of them into your graveyard. So something I want to note here is that I made a mistake in yesterday's video where we saw other cards that were like this, that if it was neither day nor night, it becomes day as the card enters the battlefield. And in looking at these cards, I sort of assumed, and I think it's sort of intuitive, it's probably what a lot of people assumed, that when it enters the battlefield, if it's not night or day, you end up getting the trigger that you get whenever day becomes night or night becomes day. But you actually don't, because it has to already be night or day to get that trigger. So these sorts of triggers aren't going to happen on a board where it's not already night or day, but these cards do all make it so night and day begins to get tracked, and that means it will ultimately allow you to trigger these abilities. And yeah, I mean, if you're going between night and day, this gives some decent card selection, and it can load your graveyard with flashback and disturb cards, but it has mediocre stats, and its ability also really isn't that exciting. So I think it's probably just a C-. Next up, it's Chaplin of Alms, which for 1 white mana is a 1/1 human cleric at uncommon with first strike. It's got ward 1 and disturb for 3 generic and a white. And when it transforms, it has flying and first strike. It's a 2/1, and each creature you control has ward 1. So the 1 mana 1/1 first strike side of this would really only make the cut in the most aggressive of decks that are adept at boosting its stats, so you can get the best mileage possible out of first strike. But of course, adding Disturb to the card makes it into something you'll play in every single white deck. I mean, honestly, if this was always just a 4 mana 2/1 with flying and first strike that gave ward 1 to your whole board, you'd play that, and this is more flexible than that. You can definitely first pick this. I'm giving it a B. Next up, it's Clarion Cathars, which for 3 generic and a white is a 3/3 human knight at common, and when it enters the battlefield, you make a 1/1 white human creature token. We see cards like this a lot, and it's pretty much always a C+ when we see it. 2 bodies for 4 mana is nice, and the reasonable stats distributed across them is pretty good. Giving it a C+. Next up, it's Curse of Silence, which for 1 white mana is a rare enchantment or a curse with enchant player. As it enters the battlefield, you choose a card name. Spells with the chosen name enchanted player casts cost 2 more to cast. And whenever enchanted player casts a spell with the chosen name, you may sacrifice Curse of Silence. If you do, draw a card. This is terrible in Limited. Predicting what your opponent has is impossible, so most of the time this does stone nothing. Even if you do name a card they have, there's a good chance they won't ever draw that copy of that card anyway, and this won't matter at all. The one time where I could see this maybe working out is if you sided in against someone who has like 3 to 4 copies of a really strong common or uncommon because it has a better chance of disrupting that opponent than most. But even then, I'm not thrilled about this. I'm giving it an F. Next up, it's Dual Craft Trainer, which for 3 generic and a white is a 3/3 human soldier at uncommon. It's got first strike, and if you get Coven going at the beginning of combat, you get to give double strike to target creature you control. A 4 mana 3/3 with first strike is probably at least a C-, so the Coven upside here is pretty nice to have on an already reasonable card. Double strike to any one of your creatures is quite powerful and will just enable attacks you didn't have before. You won't always be able to pull it off, of course, but the floor here is really reasonable. I'm giving this a C+. Next up, it's Enduring Angel, which for 2 generic and 3 white is a 3/3 angel at mythic rare with flying and double strike. It gives you hexproof, and if your life total would be reduced to 0 or less, instead transform Enduring Angel, and your life total becomes 3. Then, if Enduring Angel didn't transform this way, you lose the game. And when it transforms, it becomes Angelic Enforcer, which is a star creature with flying, still gives you hexproof, and its power and toughness are each equal to your life total, and when it attacks, you double your life total. So a 5 mana 3/3 with flying and double strike is already a pretty good card. It hits hard in the air and provides a very quick clock. The downside is that a 5 mana 3 toughness creature dies for a lot less than 5 mana in many cases, but that's okay. This comes with a lot of additional upside. Giving you hexproof won't come up a ton, and it won't always transform either. But when she does, she can save you from dying and then increase your life total. If it does have to transform, it can help you dig out of a serious hole. So this has a good baseline and some decent upside. I do think it falls short of bomb status, but not by much, and this would be an easy card to underrate since it's so strange. But for now, I'm giving it a B+. Next up, it's Fateful Absence, which for 1 generic and a white is a rare instant, and it says destroy target creature or planeswalker. Its controller investigates, and that means your opponent gets a clue artifact creature token with the ability to pay 2 generic mana and sack that token to draw a card. Letting your opponent investigate is a pretty real downside. It means your opponent ultimately gets a 2-for-1. The good news is, this does deal with the creatures or planeswalkers very efficiently, and in some ways it is better to use earlier, because your opponent probably won't have time to use that clue for a while. So it's better to use it to help you pressure your opponent early, because in the later game they'll just be cracking it right away, and that's not going to feel great. You can, of course, target your own stuff with it in a pinch, in which case it's a really bad version of cycling, but sometimes that will be worth doing. The downside here is real enough that I think this falls short of premium, despite the fact that it's both unconditional and efficient. I'm giving it a C+. Next up, it's Flair of Faith, which for 1 generic and a white is a common instant. Target creature gets +2/+2 until end of turn. If it's a human, instead, it gets +3/+3 and gains indestructible until end of turn. This seems like a decent trick if you're a white aggro deck with lots of humans in it. It gives a decent stats boost that will often allow your creatures to win combat, even if it's not a human. But when you do use it on a human, that creature is going to be able to win virtually any combat, and you could even use it to save a creature from removal spells. This seems like a pretty nice trick for aggro decks. It is still a trick, though, with all the limitations tricks have. They're situational, and they're sometimes risky, but that means it's a C. Next up, it's Gavin Dawnguard, which for 1 generic and 2 white is a 3/3 human soldier at uncommon. It's got Ward 1, and if it's neither day nor night, it becomes day as the dawnguard enters the battlefield. Whenever a day becomes night or night becomes day, look at the top 4 cards of your library. You may reveal a creature card with mana value 3 or less from among them and put it into your hand. Put the rest on the bottom of your library in any order. This seems quite strong. A 3-mana 3/3 with Ward 1 is already something you'd play pretty much all the time, but the night-day payoff here is very real. Your deck does need to have a relatively low curve to consistently draw a card with it, but drawing 1 card with this over the course of a game isn't far-fetched, and that means you're getting a 2-for-1. This seems like a great uncommon for white. I'm giving it a B. Next up, it's Gavin Silversmith, which for 3 generic and a white is a 2/3 human soldier at common. When it enters the battlefield, you put a +1/+1 counter on each of up to 2 target creatures. This looks pretty nice. If you have at least 1 other creature in play, you're going to put the other counter on your Silversmith, so you're getting a 4-mana 3/4 and putting a counter on another creature who can attack that turn potentially. That's a pretty good deal. Sometimes you'll be able to add 2/2 to the board that can attack right away, too. I think this is a C+. Next up, it's Gavin Trapper, which for 1 white is a 0/2 human soldier at common, and you can pay 2 and tap it to tap target creature. Master decoys are always pretty nice and limited. They can act as removal of sorts and stay relevant all game long. Really, in this case, it's pretty useless in the early game other than being able to block 1/1s because it's a 0/2, and actually more useful late, with one exception. This has the additional upside of being a 0-power creature, which is good for Coven decks. There aren't a lot of 0-power creatures around, so this will often just check the mark on, look, I have a creature in play with a different power than 2 of my other creatures. It'll do it much more often than most other cards in the format. All of that together means this is a C+. Next up, it's Hedge, Witch's Mask, which for 1 white is an artifact equipment at common. Equipped creature gets +1/+1 and can't be blocked by creatures with power 4 or greater, and it has an equip cost of 2. This is a decent, albeit unimpressive, piece of equipment. 1 to play and 2 to equip is kind of alright, and the upside of being unblockable by bigger stuff doesn't hurt. Still, this format doesn't have a huge equipment theme, or any equipment theme for that matter, and that probably means this gets cut a lot. I'm giving it a C-. Next up, it's Homestead Courage, which for 1 white mana is a common sorcery, and it says put a +1/+1 counter on target creature you control. It gains vigilance until end of turn, and it has flashback for 1 white mana. This does give a nice, efficient boost twice. It isn't a boost that always makes a difference, though, and even when it does, I'm not sure we'll always feel like you're getting a full card worth of value. Being cheap to flashback is good for flashback payoffs and also makes it easy to turn it back into day, and that matters, but I think this is probably just a D+. If the format's ultra aggressive, it could move up. Next up, it's Intrepid Adversary, which for 1 generic and a white is a 3/1 mythic rare human scout with lifelink. When it enters the battlefield, you may pay 1 generic and a white any number of times. When you pay this cost 1 or more times, put that many Valor counters on Intrepid Adversary. Creatures you control get +1/+1 for each Valor counter on Intrepid Adversary. So there's a whole cycle of these adversaries. They're all cheap creatures that have a multi-kicker-like ability that both makes them bigger and gives you some other effect, and they're all pretty awesome. This one is a 2-mana 3/1 with lifelink, and that's a card you would always play. It blocks and attacks reasonably well, but all the upside here is just insane. For each 2 additional mana you sink into it, the more it pumps your entire board. This means the power of this card scales massively as the game goes on, and if you draw it on a stalled out game and you have like 8 mana or even 6 or even 4, you probably just won the game on the spot. Note, by the way, that it also counts itself, so it becomes less fragile the more mana you pump into it. This is kind of a rare thing to see, but this is a 2-mana card that's a bomb. Granted, when it feels like a bomb, you're definitely paying more than 2 mana for it, but it's still a great card. It's an A. Next up, it's Loyal Griff, which for 2 generic and a white is a 2/2 hippogriff at uncommon. It's got flash and flying, and when it enters the battlefield, you can return another creature you control to its owner's hand. A Windrake with Flash is already something that would frequently make the cut, and this comes with the additional upside of allowing you to bounce 1 of your creatures. This can help a creature avoid removal, or allow you to retrigger an into the battlefield ability, or return a card that you've put the Disturbed Spirit into play. Maybe you want to play it as a regular creature again. It can let you do that. It isn't always going to happen that you actually get to do something with this, but because the baseline here is fine, I'm not too upset about that. I'm giving it a C+. Next up, it's Lunarch Veteran, which for 1 white mana is a 1/1 human cleric at common, and whenever another creature enters the battlefield under your control, you gain 1 life, and it has Disturb for 1 generic and a white, and when it transforms, it becomes Luminous Phantom, a 1/1 flyer that says whenever another creature you control leaves the battlefield, you gain 1 life. Like basically every card with Disturb, this is certainly playable. A 1-mana 1/1 with this life gain effect isn't super impressive in a format that doesn't really have a strong life gain theme, but it's kind of okay. It would probably be like a D+. And the disturb effect here does really matter because you end up getting 2 bodies out of 1 card and you really only pay 3 mana for them, and that's not a bad deal for what you're getting. Now, neither half of this card is going to be letting you trade because they're so small, but this still seems like a nice common. I'm giving it a C. Next up, it's Morning Patrol, which for 2 generic and a white is a 2/3 human soldier at common. It's got vigilance, and it has disturb for 3 generic and a white. When it transforms, it becomes Morning Apparition. Clever wordplay. It's got flying and vigilance, and it's a spirit soldier, and it's a 2/1. A 3-mana 2/3 with vigilance is probably a D+ or a C-, so the fact this can come back as a 2/1 with flying and vigilance is quite nice. I think it's a C+ for limited. Next up, it's Audric's Outrider, which for 3 generic and a white is a 2/4 human knight at uncommon, and when it or another creature you control dies, you put a +1/+1 counter on target creature you control. This is pretty good. First, it counts itself dying, so most of the time the Outrider will give you some value, even if it isn't long for this world. The black-white deck is all about sacrificing, and the green-white deck likes going wide with tokens, and it's a good fit in either of those decks, since creatures will be dying a whole lot. And really, creatures just die all the time in Magic anyway. So yeah, I think the whole package here looks pretty strong, like the kind of engine that can really win you a game, and the floor is pretty reasonable. I'm giving it a B-. Next up, it's Ritual Guardian, which for 2 generic and a white is a 3/2 human soldier at common. It's got a Coven ability, and in this case, at the beginning of combat, it gets lifelink if you get Coven online. If this was a 3-mana 3/2 with lifelink all the time, it would probably be a C+. The fact that it won't always have it, and in fact probably won't a decent chunk of the time, makes it significantly worse than that because a 3-mana 3/2 is a pretty ugly stat line. I think there's enough upside here for it to stick around at C, though. Next up, it's Ritual of Hope, which for 1 generic and a white is an uncommon instant, and it says creatures you control get +1/+1 until end of turn. It has a Coven effect, though, and instead, if you have Coven online, you get +2/+1 to your whole board instead. This is a nice payoff for going wide, especially if you get Coven going, since it becomes Inspired Charge for half the mana. The good news is, by the time a card like this tends to be useful, you're kind of likely to have Coven online, since you'll have to have a board with several different creatures on it, and those several different creatures are likely to have 3 or more powers among them. Obviously, you won't be playing this in anything other than really aggressive decks, but it seems like a nice pump spell for them. I'm giving this a C. Next up, it's Search Party Captain, which for 3 generic and a white is a 2/2 human soldier at common. It costs 1 less to cast for each creature you attacked with this turn, and when it enters the battlefield, you draw a card. I like this a lot. A 4-mana 2/2 that draws you a card is like a C-, and decreasing that cost even by 1 is a huge upgrade. So the fact that sometimes you can play this for 2 or 1 mana and then cast what you draw seems really good. It has a really reasonable baseline and kind of a crazy ceiling. I think this is a B-. Next up, it's Sigarda's Splendor, which for 2 generic and 2 white is a rare enchantment, and when it enters the battlefield, you note your life total. At the beginning of your upkeep, draw a card if your life total is greater than or equal to the last noted life total for Sigarda's Splendor, then note your life total, and whenever you cast a white spell, you gain 1 life. So, if you could consistently draw a card with this, it would be crazy strong, and it helps you find a way to do that since it gains you life when you cast white spells. However, this set does not have a strong life gain sub-theme, and the Splendor alone often won't be enough to keep you at that life total in a lot of games. That said, sometimes games just stall out and you stay at a life total for a while, and this makes it so your opponent either has to let you draw cards like crazy or give up some resources to chip in for a few damage, and in either case, that's likely to make them lose. But one big problem here is that you have to keep noting your life total, so you have to continually be staying at the same life or gaining life to keep drawing cards, and that does seem like it's going to be a problem in some games. If your opponent does something to really get you behind on life, this will probably stop doing anything. If this set had more of a life gain archetype, the Splendor would probably be a pretty nice build around. As it is, it seems like it will do nothing or very little far too often. I think it's just a D. Next up, it's Sigardian's Savior, which for 3 generic and 2 white is a 3/3 angel at Mythic Rare. It's got flying, and when it enters the battlefield, if you cast it, you return up to 2 target creature cards with mana value 2 or less from your graveyard to the battlefield. Even if you only reanimate one thing with this, you're going to feel pretty good about the 5 mana you spend, so the times where you reanimate 2 things will feel amazing. Most of the time, you probably will be able to get that one creature, and without trying too hard. If you have this in your hand, you can be a lot more aggressive setting up trades since they won't really be trades for you in the end, so you might even have a better chance of having 2 things to reanimate. And certainly getting 1 thing on turn 5 is pretty likely. And what's great is, in a pinch, you can play this as a 5-mana 3/3 flyer and nothing more, and while that isn't what you want to be doing, it isn't bad as a fail case on a card that is frequently going to give you a 2-for-1 or a 3-for-1. I think the range for how good this card will perform is pretty high, and I think it does enough to get into the lower bomb range, giving it an A-. Next up, it's Soul Guide Gryff, which for 4 generic and a white is a 3/4 Hippogriff Spirit at common. It's got flying, and when it enters the battlefield, exile up to 1 target card from a graveyard. This has decent flying stats, and exiling a card with flashback or disturb is pretty relevant in this format. I think it's a C. Next up, it's Gold Barrage, which for 2 generic and a white is a common instant, and it says destroy target creature with toughness 4 or greater. This isn't premium removal, as cards with 4 toughness aren't always going to be around. There's going to be a lot of things it just can't kill. It can kill a lot of scary things for sure, but it will be useless often enough that it can't really get above a C+. Next up, it's Gold Sentinel, which for 1 generic and a white is a 3/2 human soldier at rare. When it enters the battlefield or attacks, you exile up to 1 target card from a graveyard, and it has a Coven ability. If you have Coven fulfilled, you can pay 1 generic and a white and choose a color, and the Sentinel gains hexproof from that color until end of turn and can't be blocked by creatures of that color this turn. Kind of interesting they didn't just give this protection. It's not quite as good as protection, but it's not that far off either. Anyway, this is a 2-mana 3/2 that can take away at least 1 key graveyard card from your opponent, and that's already a card you'd probably play that would get a C in this format. And if you can get Coven online, it becomes a real problem for your opponent because it becomes immune to some of their removal spells, if you have the mana available, and it'll be unblockable on a lot of board states too. This is a B. Next up, it's Sunset Revelry, which for 1 generic and a white is an uncommon sorcery. It says if an opponent has more life than you, you gain 4 life. If an opponent controls more creatures than you, create 2/1/1 white human creature tokens. And if an opponent has more cards in hand than you, draw a card. This has a neat design, but it seems pretty awkward. Basically, you have to be behind your opponent in one way or another for this to do something. And yeah, if you get all 3 modes here, you're doing a lot. But if you're just drawing a card and gaining 4 life, that's not a great card. We see that card all the time, and it isn't good. You basically need to be getting the tokens in one of the other modes for this to feel like you're doing an okay job, and it's just pretty hard to control those sorts of things. This will feel really good if you're behind on all of these things, but it does stone nothing if you're ahead, and that's not really a card I'm that interested in. I'm giving it a D. Next up, it's Thraben Exorcism, which for 1 generic and a white is a common instant, and it says exile target spirit, creature with disturb, or enchantment. Against some opponents, this will feel really good, namely blue-white, but against other decks, it just won't have targets often enough to be worth it. This means it's a sideboard card. I think it's too much of a liability to play in your main deck, like an F there, but if you're playing best of 3, bringing it in out of your sideboard will feel pretty good against the right decks. It's probably a C+ as far as sideboard cards go. Next up, it's Unruly Mob, which for 1 generic and a white is a 1/1 human at common, and whenever another creature you control dies, you put a +1/+1 counter on it. This is a reprint from the other 2 visits to Innistrad, and it wasn't that great either time. It was like a C at best. It does grow as the game goes on, but starts out really small and grows slowly. Also, it's only your creatures dying, which makes it a little bit narrow. But this might actually be better in this format than we've seen it in the past, mostly because black-white is a sacrifice deck and green-white is a token deck this time around, and both of them will be having creatures die at a pretty high rate. I still don't think it's amazing, but I think it's going to be at least a C like it's been in the past. Next up, it's Vanquish the Horde, which for 6 generic and 2 white is a rare sorcery that costs 1 less to cast for each creature on the battlefield, and it says destroy all creatures. Sweepers are pretty nice and limited, since they alter the game in a way that really no other card can. They can single-handedly help you escape a game where you have no hope. This one starts out pretty expensive, but if it's worth casting, it won't usually cost more than 4 or 5. The Wraths do always have the downside of not being quite as good in an aggro deck, but even there, they remain pretty good. There are definitely situations where you'd rather draw a creature than wipe out the Horde in that type of deck, but there will also be times where resetting the board will get you there. This does start pretty expensive, and there will be times that it comes up, and it is of course somewhat situational, but I think the effect is so powerful and irreplaceable enough that it gets pretty close to being a bomb, giving it a B+. Alright, those are my thoughts on all the white cards in Innistrad Midnight Hunt. Tomorrow, I'll be back to talk about blue. If you want to stay aware of the future videos as well as others, please subscribe and turn on notifications. If you're looking for the rest of this review, you should see a playlist on your screen shortly. And if you enjoyed this video and found it helpful, don't forget to share it and like it so that others can watch it too. Thanks for watching, and see you again tomorrow.